In the tribal people, or the first people, we have a governance that is very important and also very meaningful to the people of the land. And that gives us a great responsibility in many ways. And one of those ways I will speak of today is when you choose someone who's going to lead for you. In my language, they call that Tewehu Tugihati. Which one among you is going to lead for the people? And in order to lead for the people need to understand what it is that you're going to represent them and how you're going to represent them. And those debates or those discussions happen years, months prior to selecting their leader. And everyone is given an opportunity, whether they should support, not support, or go along with why we're picking a leader. And in this case, that's why I say it's an honor to introduce a young man that's going to come up and speak. I think all those principles that his community had in making that choice for him to speak on their behalf, in my mind and what I've heard this morning, I think they made a right choice. Because sometimes we have people who will come up here and give you all the things and good things you want to hear. But that doesn't make any changes because it just becomes the words that you want to hear. What makes a change is the words that you've never heard. And those are the changes that are meaningful. And I think Miles has done a wonderful job this morning. So without further ado, you didn't come and listen to me. Miles Richardson.
Okay, we got a couple of hours to get through this, and I don't want to spend all that time talking. I saw about 10 hands up when we had to break for lunch before. I really hope we can continue our dialogue, and as I was saying, as my grandfather used to call it, sharpen each other up. And I hope I didn't create some expectation this morning that I was going to give you some profound sermon on spirituality, because I'm not. I just think spirituality as a grounding for our values, which should, as human beings, as human societies, which ought to direct our actions, is one of our weaknesses today as human societies. And I really want to participate in strengthening that. And I say that, during the 150 years that I talked about this morning of the relationship with Canada, one of the key steps, and I know it was a colonial method used all over the world, but before the colonizers came into Haida Gwaii and other parts of Canada, the missionaries came first. And the missionaries spread amongst our people an expectation of the goodness of the people that were coming and the rule of law that they were asking our people to adopt. And our people bought that. They trusted that. And brought in constructive relations initially between our people and this nation state of Canada. We didn't bargain for the colonialism. That was strengthened and pushed a bit later, but the promise of Canada and the promise of justice and humans being treated equally was a pretty compelling vision. And I say that from personal experience. My family has a deep relationship with Christianity. My grandmother, my mother's mother, she never complained about residential school. And I'm not saying that diminishes anybody else's experiences, but she got taken away from Haida Gwaii when she was about 8 years old and brought down to the Fraser Valley to a place called Kokalitsa, where a lot of coastal people were taken, and she never got home till she was a teenager, a late teenager, and she learned one thing that I really know, that she was the world's best, most devoted Christian. And I know she prayed every day and didn't push it down our throat, but always had us honor the Bible and Christ. And that was just the way our family was. Her husband, my grandfather, his father was the first Christian in Skidegate. And he grew up, that was my mother's father. He felt ripped off because he never went to residential school. His dad was blind and he had to stay home and look after him. So he grew up, living off the land and living our traditions. He was born in a longhouse. His father, my great-grandfather, was Gdansk. He only had that name. He was in line to be one of the biggest chiefs in the Haida Nation. And as a young man, he joined the flotilla in the 1860s, the late 1800s. They used to go down to Victoria, to the trading post there, every year. And hundreds of canoes would go down there. And the Haida camp was where the Empress Hotel is today. Matter of fact, the Esquimalt and Songhees are always ribbing me, asking why don't we claim that back? That used to be known as Haidaville. But every nation had their own camp there. So Gdansk, my great-grandfather, who was being groomed to be a Haida chief, would walk up. They had Government Street then, if any of you know Victoria. That was the only street. And on the top of that hill, from the Inner Harbor to up Government Street, was a Methodist church. And he used to walk up there and he loved the hymns. He loved the Christian hymns. So he'd sit outside and listen to them. Finally, the preacher invited him in and befriended him and started teaching him about the scriptures, about the Bible, and eventually gave him his name. His name was Amos Russ. That was my great-grandfather's English name, his first English name. He took it from the Methodist preacher. He came home and he renounced his chieftainship, his Gdansk. 80% of our population had been decimated with disease, and they didn't understand what was going on, and they were trying to figure out a way to survive. And I'm not making excuses for him as much as telling his story. And he became a Christian convert and very much advocated for the Methodist and eventually the United Church. And then his wife, my grandmother's sister, married Peter Kelly, who some of you may have heard of, who was an ordained Methodist and eventually United Church minister. He ministered to the whole coast. He was a big, strapping Haida guy, and I know my mom and aunts used to tell me about the white people used to hate having this Indian minister to him, and he'd just stand up and say, "This is our church, but I'm the ordained minister, and I'm going to carry God's word to you." You know, he insisted, as they're supposed to all insist on their equality before God. But he was quite a man. I remember when I was a little kid, him coming in. Eventually, instead of him paddling around, they got him a big mission boat, Thomas Crosby 5. I remember it coming in front of our house, and he came to visit my mom. I was just a little kid playing in the yard, and I'll never forget him coming by, and we're playing there, and he ruffles my hair and looks at me and goes in and has tea with my mom. That was my whole experience with him. But in 1924, he led, even as a ordained minister, he led the Allied tribes of BC with Andrew Paul of the Salish to Ottawa. It took them a week to get there from Vancouver by train. And they addressed a joint session of Parliament and the Senate. You can read their address today in Hansard, word for word. And they went and made the case, the title case, way more eloquently than I am today. They were amazing. And, you know, Parliament and the Senate, far from hearing their appeal, they were appealing to their own humanity, to their own spirituality, to their own rule of law. And when they left, they didn't pick up their appeal. They legislated away the potlatch. They legislated away the core institutions of our governance. And they made it illegal for us to hire lawyers to press the title case in court. And just did all they could to carry out that assimilation agenda. And this is under the guise of Christianity. So it's always been a double-edged sword with me, but I also always have this thought. You know, I've worked with Project North, I've worked with different churches on the various campaigns we have, but I always thought they brought the notion of Canada to us initially. Maybe there's an important role, there ought to be an important role for people of faith, for Christians of faith in bringing about reconciliation. And I continue to believe that, and that's why I'm here today. Another thing that my grandfather stressed to me, he always said, Haida saw commonalities with Christianity. You know, he would tell me that our Creator is the same as their God. There's only one Creator for all of us, he'd tell me. But very early, he stressed to me that Christianity had many of the same beliefs as our people. You know, for instance, he'd say, before any foreigner came to Haida Gwaii with other religions, our people rested every seventh day. My grandfather told me, he said, that's just the way we lived. That was part of our belief. That was part of who we are. And he had many, many stories or anecdotes about how Christianity was striving to uncover, to reveal the same truth that our spirituality was struggling to reveal. Was a constant work in progress to understand that. And that's where I think we can bind together in having our spiritual beliefs, our worldview, if you will, inform our values and who we are as societies, and bind us together in action. But we need to accept what I referred to this morning as this responsibility for our relationship to place and for our actions as individuals and societies. I really think we need to find ways to step that up. You know, we look at the political system today, and we've got an election coming up in October 19th, 3 weeks or so, a little over 3 weeks, and too often we don't send leaders to our seats of government. We send politicians whose only concern is retaining power, on getting re-elected. They don't provide leadership at times like this when we need it. Reconciliation is going to require leadership. We should accept that responsibility and demanding that of people that we put in those positions, and keep them accountable as we go forward. When we look at the political action that I was saying was required this morning, the recognition of who each of our nations are as Indigenous peoples, as nations, and the steps toward reconciliation, if we were guided by our spiritual beliefs, it would take us right down that path. I was so encouraged that when I heard the Pope's encyclical for 2015, as I told you this morning, when he recognized that one thing we've missed as Christians, he put it, in interpreting the scriptures, is that third really important relationship between man and the rest of creation. That statement, that belief, is at the core of all the Indigenous spirituality that I've had the honor to be exposed to in my life. And it didn't, it just happened because of the nature of my business as leader of the Haida Nation. I remember I got invited very early on, when I was a young leader, to a meeting of the Circle of Traditional Elders. It was an amazing group of spiritual leaders from tribes throughout North America. The Hopi, the Seminoles, the Haudenosaunee, the Wablakis from California, and us, the Haidas, who are still involved in that. Anyway, they invited me to join them at the Fourth World Wilderness Congress. And what was happening there is 55 nations. I remember this was quite an event in Denver, Colorado. Up on the stages, all the bankers, David Rockefeller and Lawrence Rockefeller, Edmund de Rothschild III, the family that financed the Second World War for Britain. Up there was James Baker III, who was then Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. I think it was for the first Bush. The who's who of political leaders in the world, and they're up there saying, okay, this is the Fourth World Wilderness Congress. They're saying, this environment issue you environmentalists are bringing forward, we want to acknowledge is very important, but we want to tell you that there's something that's more important: economic growth. This was their message. And the First Nations, they were there as spiritual leaders. They were beside themselves, saying, how ignorant can we be? And that was my first exposure to them. And their message, they got together and sent Oren Lyons up to in front of this World Wilderness Congress to deliver their message, said, our environment is a matter of survival. Economic growth is just a matter of interpretation. They were putting forward the message to the world that we are interdependent with all of the rest of creation. And this is a common spiritual belief amongst Indigenous people in North America, and as we found from around the world. That was a core belief, together with their sense of place, their relationship to place, which was first a relationship of responsibility as human beings. And also some, like our people, took that to the sense of ownership, on a par with Western civilization's concepts of ownership. Our people had a similar thing. Not all Indigenous people are that strong on the own, or that different things work for different tribes, but with us, our ownership amounts to jurisdiction. But always before that was the sense of responsibility. And that was guided by those spiritual beliefs, that worldview that was underpinned by those values. So that was really important. And in my life, in my career, I've got myself into some terrible binds. And I shouldn't say myself, I was the leader of people, and our people collectively figured out ways of getting through this. You're bang on, my story isn't just my story, it's my people's story. And I remember when we were getting out and blockading non-violently the logging industry on our island, bringing it under control. We got into, we're dealing with the economic status quo, not only in British Columbia and Canada, some of the biggest companies backed by governments, and we got into situations where we didn't really have a clear way out of. And then our elders guided us to practice our rituals, our spiritual ceremonies. And I tell you, it changed everything in terms of being able to communicate and have other people hear you, but also to have them come and be by our side. I couldn't explain to you logically or step by step how it worked, but I absolutely believe it was true, and it led to the political successes that I was reporting to you this morning. I know one time we moved ahead of the logging. We're blockading, we're in and out of court. The charges kept getting ramped up, and we're at contempt of court, which is serious jail time. So we moved the blockades a watershed ahead to a pristine watershed where they hadn't touched. We built a house. And then, so we're just waiting for the confrontation, and then just out of the blue, 2 Cree medicine men from somewhere around here show up. We didn't know who they were. They showed up and they said, we're emissaries from the Hopi Nation, and we've come with a set of 3 crystals they've sent us with. They've given us instructions on how to align them, because when you do this, Haida ceremonies are going to align with Hopi ceremonies and thereby strengthen them. I had no time for this, and my elders just said, you got time for this. Let's do this. And we did that and started practicing our own ceremonies, and I'll tell you, things became effortless. Ask a scientist to explain it. I don't think they can. Well, I know that, but one thing, the sum total of that is I have come to have a deep trust in my culture. Did any of you ever wonder why Miles Richardson can stand up in front of you and seriously claim to be the living generation of a people that's 15,000 years old? Why is that? How does such a thing happen? Is it an accident? Is there some reason that our people have existed that long? You know, in developed societies and ways of expressing ourselves through our art and culture that are at least the par of any in human history, in my opinion. Why is that? You know why that is? It's because our people built and distilled the wisdom that comes from living in one place through hundreds of generations and trusted that. You know, you can't put a scientific model around that, but I mean, I know that's why I'm here today. And if you talk about spirituality and struggling to clarify it in terms of our own integrity and then living it, that's the test to me. And I think each of us would be stronger for having done that. And certainly, you know, my culture, I totally trust it, but it's a living thing. It's my challenge to adapt it to today's circumstances, to today's world, and be able to communicate it to the next generations in a way that they trust and respect. And most importantly, we'll put action to. And that's been our saving grace. So, and I think Christianity has the same challenges. And for a while there, we both started slipping in turning the understanding of our values to action. So we got work to do, and I think we'd be much more effective doing it together. So that's my view on spirituality as it relates to politics. Now I want you to tell me how to make that work. Let's have a discussion. You know, I think I'd love to leave here, and like I was saying to some of them at lunch, and march together in one project. Make reconciliation a core action of Canadian society today. It's not all we'll do, but it could be a huge positive amongst all of us. I'd love to find a way of leaving here today and all just locking arms and going forward. And even just in the things we do every day, you know, I don't think we have to do anything over the top or give up our lives to do it, but just to act with integrity, to be who we say we are, whether we're Christians or Indigenous people, to be who we say we are and have the courage and the conviction of our values. That's too rare. Thank you.